fences, but unfortunately asbestos fences are not conducive to their continuance. Also, this is the biggest gathering I think I've seen for a number of years, so I'm rather overawed. Anyway, my name's Heterick, and I'm working at the museum with Terry and others, ornithologists, as a retiree who's still working, because you never retire in science. And my special area is ant taxonomy, and currently I'm working on just completed a book on the ants of Western Australia, which covers well over 800 species and everything that's known about them, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. So I thought that was a rather nifty picture I've seen of 4 ants belonging to the Doralini subfamily of ants that raid other ants, and they've obviously been given a marker, and someone's been studying the nest, and they look very much as though they're in a discussion together, probably about the way in which they've been treated by scientists. Now, what is an ant? It's not as simple as you might think. They belong to the order Hymenoptera, which is bees, wasps and ants, and in contrary to many people's ideas, they all belong to just one family. So that's the Formicidae. Most are social insects, and there are a few exceptions. There are parasites, which are workerless queens, which live on the nests of other ants, and they're only found in conjunction with the host species, and they don't produce their own workers. Others do live also as parasites, but they do produce their own workers. Now, some amazing facts about ants, some obvious ones and ones you may not know. First of all, they have some have snap jaws, and I'm not getting my screen pictures on the side here, but I won't worry about that, I think I know them. There's a genus called Odontomachus, and it has mandibles that can snap together at a millisecond or less. It's actually the equal fastest response in the world. I think the other claimant is a mantis shrimp. So some of them have an extremely quick bite, and they use this either to impale their prey or defend themselves against other species. And some ants actually pinch the ants that are attacking them, and they shoot them away, like the way you click and throw away some rubbish. Up to 43 species of ants have been found, and 26 genera have been found in one rainforest tree. So ants can be found in very diverse communities in some situations, particularly rainforests. So nearly always, if you go around and you look at an area of woodland, even in Perth, around the back of Perth, you might find up to 70 or 80 species of ants. And even in backyards, such as my own backyard at East Fremantle, or my parents' backyard actually, there was quite a quarter-acre block. We had up to about 25 species of ants in very degraded urban lawn and exotic trees and so on like that. So ants are far more diverse than we imagine. Often people talk to me, how many ants are there? I know there's black ants and red ants. And I say, well, which of the 50 or 60 species of red ants that you talk about, or 100 species of black ants that you're talking about? And they look at me in astonishment. Ants can, in huge numbers, although they're not actually small insects, they're medium-sized insects in terms of comparison vols or some other creatures. So they're medium-sized organisms. We are monstrous organisms, by the way. Very few creatures are bigger than a human. So ants are about average size. But they're actually far more, the actual biomass of ants, say in the Amazon, actually outweighs all vertebrates, including jaguars and peccaries and tigers and all the other large mammals. So they actually are in huge numbers. In Africa, condemned, this is back in the 1800s and earlier, occasionally condemned criminals would be tethered in the path of driver ants, which are legionary ants which move in large columns, and they'll kill anything in their path. They're probably wouldn't eat the people, but they would kill them and bite them to death. So they were used in Nigeria, I think in Nigeria and places like that, occasionally. It wasn't a call for execution, but it's a rather grisly one. They can lift many times their own weight, as I can't bring up the little notes at the side there, I won't try, but they can lift very many times their own weight, perhaps 30 or 40 times, and that's because their musculature is of such a nature that they can lift, they've got striated muscles as we have, and they can lift many times their own weight. That's a commonly known fact. Back in the late 1990s, who remembers ants in the Z backwards?
Yes.
Woody Allen. And Bug's Life, does anyone remember that?
No.
Well, the rotten tomato goes to A Bug's Life because it showed a baby ant as a fully formed adult. I think there's a princess ant that was just like an adult. Bug's Life at least had larval ants. It didn't have much else that was accurate, but it did have larval ants, so it was slightly more entomologically correct. So ant cinema has a way to go. Now, when I was had a postdoctoral fellowship at the California Academy of Sciences, I had the misfortune of having to have operation on my hands. So I had a syndrome that had to be operated on. And I'd been, was being prepared for the operation, and I'd just come out of it and I was groggy. I wasn't actually totally anaesthetised, I had a block in my arm, but I was pretty groggy, and I couldn't use my right hand, and I was having to sign my name with my left hand, which fortunately I practiced once or twice, so I could do that. But a nurse came up to me and asked me ingenuously, "What use is an ant?" She knew I was studying ants. And I said, they don't need to have a use. They just are. They do not need to serve us. But they do have an impact on humans. Quite a few, actually. In a good way, some ants can control crop pests. Now, to give you an example of this, in South America, atter ants, which are leaf-cutting ants, cut leaves of citrus plantations for use to make their fungus gardens. And they have massive nests in which they rear their fungus, and their depredations on the citrus orchards are really very costly. So what my colleague, Professor Jonathan Age, and others have been doing is getting another group of ants, which are a stinging form, subfamily Pomerani, and then transporting these nests to near the nests of the leafcutter ants. So these ants will prey on these leafcutter ants or their larvae, or they will just simply drive them away and protect these citrus plants. So they can control crop pests, but particularly in tropical areas. Ants are active decomposers because their burrowing underground means that leaves and other things can be, the humus can be built up, so that they are actually recyclable, woody debris, leaves and things like that. So they are decomposers. Some ants can actually kill, not necessarily through their stings because they're very small. They can have enough sting at once, but they can cause anaphylaxis and other forms of allergic reactions. And bulldog ants are one of the most dangerous hymenopterans in the world, the inch ants and bulldog ants, because multiple stings by bulldog ants can cause increasing susceptibility to severe allergic reactions. And Professor Major has been stung by them several times, and he has a slight but not serious general reaction if he gets stung a finger or something like that. So, and I think about a quarter of all cases, people who are stung multiple times will develop an increasing sensitivity to that venom. Fire ants also, and some other forms of sting ants can also cause severe reactions. In fact, fire ants are very famous for causing a necrotic pustule, so they'll actually leave a horrible little boil in the place of these stings, and if this is scratched, particularly if you're in a tropical area and exposed to bacteria, some harmful bacteria, you can get gangrene and other forms of blood poisoning and stuff like that.
Excuse me, Ryan, you wrote it out as a use, eh?
Yes, what uses of ant? Well, it can have negative uses as well as positive ones. Okay, I don't think people can see that, but they can be house or agricultural pests, and in fact you see a famous one of those. That is an Argentine ant at the top there, and a lot of ants you'll be familiar with. People who contact me very rarely want to know about ants as interesting subjects of study, but mostly want to know how to get rid of them, because they get into houses, and most of the ants that get into houses here in Australia are introduced from overseas, and that's because they have no native natural predators or parasites to control them. They just go gangbusters and build up huge populations. There can also be agriculture pests. Some of the most famous ones are the big-headed ant, which is quite common around Perth. They can be a real problem with horticultural crops or with some orchards, particularly bad. And they also protect plant lice or sucking bugs, which will be vectors of diseases of crops. So it's not only by direct damage to the crops themselves, but as protectors or vectors of disease. So, and of course they have a bad effect economically, because countries won't take in products that contain remains of these ants or where ants have been found in them. On the other hand, ants are famous, including places like Australia and South Africa, as being agents of germination by taking seeds into the protective burrows, the chambers in the nest, and the seeds there are protected. They have a nice humid environment in which to germinate, and they'll grow up particularly into valuable plants like proteas and other plants which are in the cut flower industry but grow wild. And it was in fact the Argentine ant which drove out the native species in South Africa, which caused millions of dollars worth of damage to the cut flower industry of the native plants in South Africa. So that's a very valuable use, and it's a lot of our native plants, some of the wildflowers and things like that, are very much benefited by the ants, which go for the seeds, which have a sweet aril or laosole on the ground the size of them. They eat that, but they'll take the seed into the nest, and there the seed will germinate. On the other hand, some ants, particularly introduced ants, will either eat the seed itself, or they'll just eat the little sugary flange around the seed, and they'll just leave the seed out in the open where it's eaten by rodents or by other insects, or weevils and things like that. Yes, or bugs as well, sucking some of those Heterock bugs. Now, introduced ants often also disrupt native ecosystems. They can do this directly by killing the native organisms or by outcompeting other social insects like ants and bees perhaps, particularly other ants. And they will actually quite depauperate the ecosystem, so they'll actually cause the extinction or the local extinction of many of the creatures. And in fact, if they're particularly aggressive, like the ants at Christmas Island, the yellow crazy ant, they may even attack small vertebrates like chicks of seabirds and things like that, or red crabs. And islands particularly are very damaging. So they build up in huge numbers and they will totally destroy viable ecosystems. On the other hand, as you can see here, that is on the top is not an ant, that's a beetle. I think it's a salaphid or something like that. And that and many other creatures live in ants' nests, where they are called inquilines. The inquilines are creatures that can live permanently in ants' nests, and sometimes they're not found anywhere else. So if you dig up an ant's nest, even in your backyard, you might see a little cricket that's only found in ants' nests, a little yellow cricket, a tiny one. You might see native silverfish, again, only found in ants' nests. In some of the ants' nests that belong to very large ants, like Polyrhacus, they're so large that even native mice and snakes can live in the nest. So you have small vertebrates, even mammals can live in ants' nests. And so they are not only destructive of ecosystems, they also foster other creatures. Along with being good decomposers, ants also aerate the ground, so they'll, by the tunneling into the ground, they allow oxygen to penetrate, and also water to penetrate underground, and that of course means that there's other creatures can live there, or other creatures which will be burrowing things. On the other hand, very few ants are pollinators. Now, that is because this part of the ant, this is a bordered ant, but it's a male, so it doesn't have this metapleural gland, but there's a gland there just above the leg, the hind leg, on the trunk of the ant, which we call the metapleura, and that produces phenylacetic acid, which is to protect the ant from damaging fungi or bacteria, and that unfortunately also disrupts the pollination of the pollen grains. It prevents them from being able to produce viable sperm, not sperm, but it prevents pollen grains from being viable because it's an acid. So ants are actually bad news, or at least the worker ants, the queen ants, which have the metapleural gland, or most of them do, are actually very damaging to in terms of pollination. Male ants are not, because they don't have that particular gland. Now here, I'll talk about that in a moment. Ants are used as bioindicators, which is a lot of what I've been doing in assisting Professor Major, who's an ecologist. We use ants as bioindicators to indicate the health of an environment which has been disturbed or changed in some way. And because certain groups of ants are associated with certain habitats. Some ants are only found in old growth areas, some ants will be only found in very disturbed areas, some ants will only be found in urban areas, and there's a lot of others in between. And they are, if we know something about the ants, we know them taxonomically, and we know something about their ecology, we can then start to predict how will an area which is being rehabilitated, how will that's going. Now, as you can see there, there's a robot, and that's actually a border ant, you can see from the jaws. And you can see that that's been very cleverly designed. And robots, small robots like this, are actually quite useful, first of all, to predict how they can move, or how they've been made to move, but also because they can explore areas like earthquake zones where there's rubble, and they can get into through small crevices and perhaps send back information as to whether there's people still alive under the rubble. And they're also very interesting as art forms and areas like that. So they can be used in human designs, and increasingly as we're living in an online robotic world, models of ants, the way they move and can actually be employed, are becoming more and more useful. Now, these are a series of pictures drawn, obviously quite a long time ago, because those are stylized, the sort of stylized drawings you may have seen in a very ancient manuscript, say something from the 1800s. A lot of those are from very early taxonomists or myrmecologists, so that name given to people who study ants. How many ants in the world? We're starting to get a picture now, some sort of image of how many there are. Thanks to work particularly in the California Academy of Sciences, where I studied for a couple of years. There's a lot of work being done on a huge database there, which is extremely valuable, and I use it quite frequently. It's called AntWeb. At the time I did this last year, when I set up this original talk, there are 15,284 named species. They've grown much since then because people are not doing much now because of COVID, so there's not a lot of papers going out, so it wouldn't have grown much since last year. 338 genera. This is all just one family, mind you, and 16 or 17 subfamilies. A bit of an argument over one particular subfamily. Okay, so that indicates that ants are one of the dominant families, insect families in the world. What about Western Australia? I can give you an exact figure here of what I know. Again, there will be some unknowns, particularly in the Kimberleys and places like that, but the southwest, I think we've covered that pretty well over the years. 832 species recognised in my book on the ants of Western Australia. 628 are named to some level of confidence in 76 genera. So that's a very big swag of the world's genera, much less the world's species, but in 11 subfamilies. So Western Australia is very rich in ants, not quite as rich as Queensland, which has much more extensive tropics, which is where a lot of ants live, but still a very large fauna. You can probably say that there would be at least perhaps another 50 or so ants that can be found in WA, particularly up in the north, and some areas of the desert area which haven't been explored very much. And that'll probably bring it up here, they're not 100 up, but probably not much more on that. But that's a very large number. How do we tell different ants apart? I'm not going to go through this in detail, but one of the things about all ants is that they have one or two waist segments. Now, one or two wasps also have waist segments, so it is not an absolutely definitive way of distinguishing between ants and wasps. But most wasps don't have a waist segments. But ants have one or two. We call them the nose. There's the petiole, which is that one there, and the post-petiole there. The head, of course, the antenna, which in worker ants is bent, in queens it's bent, but in male ants, which are much more like wasps, it looks like just filamentous antenna. Three pairs of legs, of course. Actually, what is not generally known is that this part here is not, in ants, is not all of the abdomen. It's only part of the abdomen. The other parts of the abdomen are here, and they are fused to the thorax. So this part here is the thorax, and the part here which I haven't shown, it's actually fused, this area here, that is part of the abdomen, and so are the waist segments. So that means that the ant is got a very flexible rear end, so if it wants to sting you or squirt acid at you, it can easily lift up its gaster, which is what we call the part here, to do that, or swivel it around, and that is one of the advantages of having those two nodes here. Now, the major subfamilies can be easily separated in one or two cases. Only the former sine, one of the major subfamilies that includes the sugar ants and quite a few other ants, has a little squirt bottle which squirts formic acid called the acetopore. And that's that little part down there, which is quite easily seen. That's a parachicana, I think, or Nomandaria. So that's only found in that subfamily there. It's a very important subfamily, one of the major ones in Western Australia. Another major group in the WA, which you often see crawling around the footpaths, are little ants which you just squash and they smell. Who knows those? Have a very strong, acrid smell. And those are the meat ants. You've all heard of meat ants. They belong to the Dolichopteridae. Now, in other countries, Dolichopteridae are much less common. Australia is one of the major centres of the radiation of this group, this subfamily. They have a little slit, and instead of squirting acid, or using a sting, they produce aldehydes, ketones, and other very toxic chemicals which, against animals about their own size, are very, very dangerous. So they'll damage the cuticle, or they'll poison other creatures. And they create that horrible smell, which is not very helpful if you see it. All the other ants have stings, but they may not be functional. So a lot of ants have stings which either are not used at all, or they'll be used for a purpose other than actually sting. Now we'll have a look at the subfamily. So I've already told you about the Dolichopteridae. These are iridodermics, which really means shiny ant. and these are a couple of meat ants checking each other out. Ants, neighbouring colonies who often fight, so they're making sure they're both friends and communicating some information with each other. And they are one of the major subfamilies in WA, particularly in the arid areas. They're not found so much in the wetter areas. So the monocotyroids are mainly found in the drier, arid and semi-arid areas. The Heterick doesn't have, it only has about 3 genera in Australia and 2 in WA, but they're particularly important because one of them, the one we see here, the greenhead ant, is quite common in gardens and in parks. It also has an unpleasant sting and occasionally can cause health problems if you're allergic to them, but mostly it's just an unpleasant sting. They are what we call an opportunist species. That means they like to go to disturbed areas. So that's also, it's another, it's not a lot of, there's quite a few species of this genus called Rhytodopona, but there's only the 2 genera in WA, but they are quite, some of them are very common. This little ant called a strobe ant or electric ant, Apis foxus, is an example of the Formicines. So he's going to have a little squirt bottle, a little acetopor at the end of his tail. These little ants go like this. They're very distinctive. They're reasonably common, not so much around Perth, but in bush areas. You'll see them in trees, and they've got very good eyesight. You see those big eyes at the corner of their head, and they'll, as soon as I see you, they'll pop around the back of the tree, because they move in this jerky motion, which apparently is beneficial because they move around quite a lot. So it's actually a very economic way of moving, apparently. But very distinctive. Once you see one of these, you'll know what it is. And also the Formicine included a lot of other ants as well, such as the sugar ants. Everyone's heard of bulldog ants. It's only the 2 genera in WA. One was the famous, who's heard of the so-called fossil ant? A few. Okay, Nathomesia. It isn't a fossil, it isn't as primitive as people now realise as we've got into the molecular genetics of the ant, but it's still very interesting, and it was certainly much more common in 60 or 70 million years ago. These here are bulldog ants, which is the Burmecia, which is the much more common genus. About 58 species I think in WA, many of them found in bush areas around Perth, not so much in the metro area, but over east where you have the jack jumper ants, the Burmecia penicilla. These ants can be a health hazard because they do cause anaphylaxis or severe allergic reactions. They are more likely to be found in built-up areas in the eastern states. That particular species is not found in WA, but close relative is. But it's not as, the one in WA is quite uncommon. And so we've got a gentleman who actually works with the health side of ants, particularly ant stings and that sort of thing, with one of the hospitals. So in the bulldog ants is a well-known group. Myrmecines, along with the Formicines, the Myrmecines are the big group of ants in WA. Many of them are very small, as you can see here, and again you'll see tiny little ants crawling around the footpaths paths in Perth. They are Myrmecines. They've got 2-way segments and a sting. Some of them can sting and some of them don't. The common rounds around Perth don't sting, don't use their sting. There are very many species. The Formicines actually have more species than the Myrmecines, but the Myrmecines have more genera. They are very diverse and found a huge number of habitats, and some of them have a lot of very interesting adaptations. So that's another, that and the Formicines are the 2 big ones. Another group, which is not quite so common, would be Ponerides. They have, some of these have a formidable sting. They're not so likely to cause problems through allergies, but they'll just give you a very nasty, painful sting. Some of them are very large. So, and that's an example of one which is a problem. I think that's a Brachypodera, that genus. One of those is found in gardens, and people occasionally get stung when they're doing gardenings. The one we have is actually a more of an orange colour than that one. So those are the 6 major subfamilies. I'm just going quickly through the minor ones. Angiopininae, a few genera. Very interesting themselves, their own rights, but they're mostly cryptic. They're found under stones and in bushland, not found in built-up areas, so you're not likely to see any of them. These are interesting ants, the Leopolera. They're doral ants. They raid other ants for other ant nests, for their grubs, their larvae, and for their pupae. They also might get a small sting, but they are basically ant raiders, so they have a specialised function in the environment because of that particular habit. This is one of the world's tiniest ants, or lightest ants, Neptunilla. It's only one genus and one species in WA. It's only about 1 millimetre long. It's almost hardly visible to the naked eye. I think we've only ever found one colony in WA near Heterick, north of Perth, but the males are quite common, so presumably they're not an uncommon ant, but they are very, very cryptic. They live well underground. They probably never come to the surface. They're blind. And they are actually prey upon small centipedes. So they're very interesting, but the average person would never follow them. Again, another group of ants which are cryptic, hardly ever seen. The predators are tiny. There are, I think, 2 genera in WA. The one here is the one most likely to see if you go in the bush and lift up a stone. You may see a fat little ant, very small, crawling around slowly. There's Discopharia. These are very, very cute, I think. They've got a little flange in front of them, and they live on arthropod eggs or spider eggs. So they're very specialised lifestyle. These are also stingers. They're not so important in WA. We have one genus, Tetrapodra, and 2 species, one of which is on the north, the other one can be found in the southwestern trees. They are arboreal species that live in wood. And but over in South America, they are very important because they actually have a mutualism with other plants, and so they'll live in special growths on the plant called Nemacodia, which are like ant cities. They are grown by the plants purely for the residence of these ants, and these ants, in return for having their own nest made by the plant, will protect that plant from herbivores, and that includes mammals like deer or other creatures which would feed on the leaves or on the plant parts. So they actually have a mutualism with the plant. So in South America, the pseudomyrmex is the ones found over there. They're a very important part of the naked environment, not so much in Australia. Now, for my book, I did maps, and these are botanical divisions that I worked out where the ants lived in this part of the world. I got all the collections from all over WA and also interstate. These are major divisions, what we call phytogeographical divisions. In other words, they've got major assemblages of plants which are distinct to those areas. So the southwest province, the desert province or the Aramaean province, and the northern province all have distinctive vegetation, and they also often have distinctive ants as well, at least the south and the north. So, distribution of ant species, this is based on collections in the Western Australian Museum and also from the Jonathan Major collection at Curtin University, but also from other collections, particularly from the Australian National Insect Collection in Canberra and some others. And the greatest number of ants that we know of are found in the southwest. But partly this is an artefact because most collecting has been done in the southwest because this is where everyone lives. So if people were to be collecting at the same degree, you'd probably find that these other spaces over here would have a lot more higher numbers. We have done a lot of work up in the Pilbara because there's a lot of iron ore companies operating there, and they have environmental consultants who use ants as a proxy for the environment. So there's a lot known about the Pilbara, and to some degree about the eastern goldfields. These areas here have hardly been collected at all, as you can see. They certainly don't have as few as 8 or 35 ants in them. They've probably got a couple of hundred, but they wouldn't be as rich as the areas here. Now, on the other hand, this area here, the Warren area, with 119 species, is probably genuinely depauperate in ant species because it is very wet and very cool, and ants don't like cool, wet conditions. They like warm, dry conditions with well-spaced vegetation. So this is probably an accurate figure, whereas these certainly are not. Okay. My new ant book is coming out probably, the proofs will probably be coming out next week, and that's about 1,000 pages perhaps of text and diagrams. There's 2 volumes now. In the first volume, I give a key to the subfamily, the genus and species, plus notes, including new synonyms. Now, synonymy means where there's 2 names for the same creature, and the oldest name has precedence by taxonomic law, which is a law too. There's a code of rules which you follow in taxonomy. So the oldest name has priority, and the other names are secondary. They can be used if, for instance, we find, those ants are different after all, so we'll go back and use those existing names. Otherwise, they become junior, what we call junior synonyms. The older name has the priority. I think there's a bit more to go here. Yes, here we go. A complete checklist for the state. That's all the named ants, colour-coded for the unknown species. For instance, I don't know, Arnold's scissor. I don't know if that's what Arnold's species JDM 433 is. What I've done in the book, because it was done in Curtin University, is to give them a voucher number. In other words, species that we don't know, whose name we don't know, or which is undescribed, is given a voucher number. In this case, JDM for Jonathan D. Major, species 433. What's really helped my work has been the number of databases. There's several. I've mentioned AntWeb. There's also AntWiki, which gives a lot of details about individual species. AntBase, and there's several others. They are excellent databases. They contain huge amounts of information. They often contain PDFs of the original papers in which these ants are mentioned and described, and which can be downloaded, so they're very, very helpful. And what I've done is give in all my keys is to give a link, such as this here, plus a figure. There will be a little figure, which is like this here, which will give you a visual clue. Now, if someone gets the hard copy, which is yet to be got out, because I'm looking for someone who will cough up $20,000 to pay for the hard copy, maybe a couple of donors, and that will have the pictures as well, and people can go to the pictures if for some reason they can't go to the electronic, the online keys. Now, what I've also done is to, where some ants are very difficult, the taxa are currently very problematic, I've got little boxes, and I discuss all the pros and cons of naming a particular species. One was a monomoreal called Myrmicon ant, and that one's a Fidoli, which is also a Myrmicon ant. And I think the third one is a Camponotus, which is a Formicon ant. So they're problem cases. I thought they're particularly interesting, so I covered those extensively. I have a large reference list, of course. There's still quite a few pages of references. A list of species complexes, so where I've said this is one ant, it may turn out that someone using molecular techniques writes, oh no, there's 3 species here, and these ants look just slightly different, but in fact they're quite distinct species. So I've put a list of possible species complexes, so as a guide to people who might be working these in future revisions, and that's in one appendix. Plus there's 148 distribution maps which cover several species at a time, in this case about 8, I think. And that shows with all the records for the ants throughout Western Australia. I also cover the known behaviour and ecology of every species. No matter how obscure, it might only be known from one specimen, it still gets a few sentences. So everything that can be known about is discussed in this book. And I also mentioned additional species from work which is done through the Tropical Ecosystems Research Station in Darwin, Heterick. The gentleman there, Dr. Alan Anderson, has done a lot of work in ants as well. And he also has keys to the ants found in the northern part of Western Australia around the Kimberley, upper part of the Pilbara. And some of these seem to be ants that are not covered in my book, so I've mentioned these from his particular notes in this book. Now, one of the important uses of ants, and this is a use, groups of ants indicate the health of the environment. A gentleman named John Greenslade, who was an ecologist who was working in South Australia back in the 70s, realised that some ants are found in certain environments. Certain groups of ants were found, groups of ants were found in certain environments. So working on from that, John Greenslade and also Alan Ansell and John Major later on have worked on what we call ant functional groups. So we look at the groups of ants, like certain dolichoderine ants, like Heterick, are often found to be dominant in certain ecosystems, such as dry ecosystems, arid ecosystems. Other ants are opportunists. They come in when there's been damage to the environment, things like the greenhead ant I showed you in the earlier picture, and several other species, or a number of other species, are ants you'll only find in very disturbed habitats. Some ants are only found in specialised situations because they have specialised mouth parts, so they may be only found with collembola, the springtails which they feed on, or other creatures which are specialised to eat. These are often solitary foragers as well. So they're another group, so there's different groups of ants, so I might actually mention them later on. So these are often collected not only by pitfall traps, but this is an example of an easy way to collect ground-crawling ants, which is pioneered by Professor Jonathan Major in South France. Some of them have specialised mandibles, like snap-jaw mandibles, and they only take a small range of prey. They might even be adapted to just one species of prey. In South America, there's a strange creature called Heterick, which has teeth like a rake. These huge prongs or tines of the teeth, and this only eats one sort of millipede, and this millipede is very hairy, so it uses these strange fork-like mandibles to scrape off all the hairs of the millipede when it catches it. So it's a very specialised mandible that's found in South America. And subordinate Campanotini is the other one. Some black there that's sort of dominant that Campanotini. These are Campanotus and one or two other species that are very, they're not always timid, as I found, but they're behavioural timid in most species. Some will bite, and they usually avoid aggressively interacting with dominant species. So if I go into a bush, as I often do, I see a lot of meat ants moving around. A lot comes a Campanotus, trot around, suddenly goes back when he comes across all this path of meat ants, and he'll scurry in between them very, very quickly so that they don't pick him up as someone to attack. So, and often they avoid aggression by being nocturnal. A lot of the Campanotus and related species are nocturnal ants. And also tropical climate specialists, and again, we don't see this very often here in the southwest, but in the tropical rainforest, ants like Ecophylla may also be dominant, just like the dolichoderines. So what do we find out using these ants as an indicator? We find out that old growth, pristine rainforests, woodlands, forests and sandplain have a low abundance of ants, a lot of species, but in small numbers. I've worked a lot on this, and I find that there's very, very many species, but low numbers. They have a wide variety of different specialties, so some will be dolichoderines, some will be Campanotini, some will be cold-climate specialists, some hot-climate specialists, so they fill a lot of these particular groups, and they're all native. You won't see any introduced ones. Where you've got secondary woodlands, such as regrowth, where the wood has been cut down and it's been replaced by plantation of native timber and so on like that, in forest and sandplain, you have greater numbers of individual species. You won't have quite so many species in terms of diversity. You'll find some of the rarer functional groups are not represented, and you'll find that the dominant species, particularly the dolichoderines, as the Heterick, will be in much higher numbers consistently than they are in the untouched areas. Where you have extreme and where you have much modified habitats, you'll have very high abundance of things like Heterick, and I and my colleagues have had a look through these pitfall traps, which you find several thousand ants in one species, and it is a pain because you know just in between them there'll be one or two others that look like them that are different. And counting through these and having the stench of the ants coming up in your nose because they have a very strong smell is a pain. So I hate having to go through these sorts of pitfall traps. But come in very high numbers, low diversity, so only a few species. Only the common functional groups we found, the Dolichoteres, the Campanatini, maybe a few Ramosides, maybe a few of the hot climate specialists. You won't see some of them, you won't see any of these other specialists. Huge numbers of dominant species and often heat-loving species because it's open ground. Melopharis and species like that love open ground because it gets very, very hot, so it's a nice place to live. But they will still be nearly all native species. But when we get into cities, you'll see huge numbers of few species, and often they're introduced, like the big-headed ant, the Argentine ant, and other species like that. There may be one or two other native ants, it'll only be tiny numbers because they just won't be able to compete with these introduced ants. And they'll often only be present, as I say, as single individuals or a couple of individuals. In most cases, not there at all. Very often we use this in simple descriptive statistics by showing a bar chart like this. So you can see that HCS is hot climate specialists, CCS is cold climate specialists, CS is crippling species and something like that. And you can see how they're represented as a proportion of the catch. So it's just a visual way of demonstrating the diversity. I'll just go back and say, before we go to this, Professor Major and myself are working on a totally different way of doing ants. We're working on an ant niche template, the ANT. And that's using some of the same ideas as the functional group analysis, but we're looking at a species level and we're looking at a much greater range of species, and we're trying to find a statistical programs that will actually spit out a figure that can be used to predict the ant communities in other environments. So that's something we're working on at the moment. We had a go at it, had our paper rejected, but rightfully so, I think, to be honest. So we've got to go back to the basics and find a way of actually statistically analysing and also giving a theoretical basis. So that's something we're working on at the moment. So that'll be something I can find in mind in the future. Okay, just to close off with, that's the heavy lifting of the ants. Now just some things to enjoy. I think this is a very cute little ant. It's found in the Philippines. Newly discovered Cardia condylum, and we've got Cardia condylara in WA as well, two or three native species, I think about 5. In fact, they don't look as pretty as this. Believe it or not, this ant can glide. Now, we've heard of gliding possums and things like that. This ant, see those phalanges, this ant and related species in the rainforests of South America, if they fall off the tree, they'll actually glide back to the tree trunk. So they'll actually position themselves in little species, they'll fall off the tree, they'll actually glide back to the tree trunk. Now, it isn't so they won't get hurt, because little ants won't get hurt if they fall to the ground. The problem is they're often near a river or something like that, and there'll be fish in there which like to eat ants. So, because these colonies might be very small, each ant is special. You're special, mate. You're in a colony of only a few hundred workers. We need you. Therefore, you've got these adaptations now. Ants in larger colonies, if they fall into the water, stiff like they can't glide. But ants like this can glide. Something was found when I was on a field trip as a tutor in Costa Rica. We had a chap who just found out that some ants glide. He just wrote, a PhD student who just wrote a paper on it. So there you go, gliding pilot. This ant is a blocker. As you can see, he's got this great big cork in his head, and that's what he does. He just gets in his nest, and to stop any intruders getting in, apart from other ants, he just puts his head there, and that's what he does all day. He just sits there with this great big block on his head. That's actually part of his skull, his head capsule, I should say. And he's probably going to be a soldier, and the smaller ants, which don't have this structure, will just go in past the other, tap on his little cork and say, hey, I belong here, I live here. And he'll say, oh, okay, that feels familiar. I'll put draw and let the other ants in. So that's what his job is. And this is a weird one. This is an ant which has a very large gland, I think it's a mandibular gland, and he can literally explode. It's not one species, it's probably a complex of Sunzine brackets. And there's a luckless sugar ant, and Camponotus, and a black one. He's attacked this ant, he's smaller than I am, and perhaps he's rather aggressive, he's going to attack him. So the other ant gives up his life, this is probably other mates around. He just explodes, and what happens, this gooey substance is probably toxic or very, very sticky, and the other ant gets entangled and is completely helpless and might be envenomated by the toxin as well. So there are several, there's actually another species of Chromatogaster which also explodes, and in this case it's the plural gland. So they actually give their lives, they initially give their lives for their colony, give their lives for their people. That's it.
Question, of course. Yes, you're certainly right about the personality of different ant species, even the different species of bulldog ants all have different personalities. So there's aggression or timidness.
I wouldn't say personality, I'd say they have behaviours. The personality might be going a little far.
Yeah, there was the I forget what your term was, the submissive.
The submissive.
Yeah,
subordinate. Yeah.
Subordinate, yes, that's one. I've seen Myrmex and Camponotus encounter each other on tree branches, and the Camponotus will literally just fling themselves off the branch in the thin air rather than face off against meat ants.
No, those ones can't.
You mentioned the invasive species, particularly in the urban areas. Have any Australian species of ants become pests overseas?
No, they have been found overseas as one of these species. I'm not. I think. Yes, they have. In New Zealand, there are several species of Australian ants that have gone over there, which are now a problem. One of them is a species recalled in the literature. It's a little monomoria, a tiny little one called Sydneyets, but in fact it's, I think it's another species. And that has become a problem in some settled parts in New Zealand. I think there's several of the Myrmex. There's one, yes, Sucurai, which is a very common ant found around the metropolitan areas. It's very much an opportunist. That, I think, has been a minor problem in New Zealand. Some of these have also gone to New Caledonia, but nothing on this scale. You see, most of the real pest ants, the big ones like the Argentine ant, the Pharaoh's ant, the Singapore ant, and the big-headed ant, these seem to have risen in the context of legionary ants like driver ants or army ants, and they have they seem to have developed this very, very distinctive traits of having huge colonies which are not hostile to one another, so, and also modern queens, and they're able to move, but have covered food preferences, they're able to move house very quickly. They seem to have risen in the context of co-evolution with army ants or driver ants. We don't have those sorts of ants, well, they do occur in Australia, they're very small, they're not significant in the environment, so we haven't had those sorts of ants which can colonise other continents very readily as these ants can. So it's actually behaviour which has probably risen in co-evolution with these sorts of ants that has led to them also being major invasive pests.
What's the fossility record for the ants like?
Pretty good. We're now starting to see that the most primitive ants are ants related to Leptonilla and Amblyopone. They're the two of the less common ones found in WA. A lot of ants have been preserved in Baltic amber, so we have quite a good representation from amber. Some ants have been preserved in stone, sediment, things like sedimentary stone, particularly flighted queens or things like that. So there's enough there to, in many cases, to find genera that are either extinct or to extinct species. And we've now got a fairly good handle on what are really quite primitive subfamilies. Some of these no longer they died out. Sometimes the dinosaurs died out. They didn't go into the mammalian, the quaternary, the tertiary. Yes.
Right. How about burners, multi-burning techniques that affect ants?
Ants will not be affected as much as terrestrial solitary arthropods because ants mostly ants live underground or well-concealed locations. They're also quite very resistant to radiation to some degree. Many ants, because the queens live underground, this is the average ants, and ants that live in trees and things like that may be more affected. Ants seem to come out of fires fairly well, but the problem will be that not so much the fires themselves, but the aftermath, because if there are specialists and specialised ants, their prey species may be very badly affected if they're like sucking bugs or springtails or something like that. And also the loss of litter layer too. And the other thing too, which will affect ants, and could cause one of our local species to become extinct, we think it might in fact be extinct, is dry. There's a frequent burning means a drier soil surface, and this itself means that those sorts of cryptic species that like moistness, moisture, humidity under logs and rocks, the logs will be destroyed, and so there's less suitable cover for them, particularly to foraging.
Any other question? Yes.
I have a question. In your book, are you going to address trinomials? Like I'm thinking trinomials, Camponotus clivus, nudimatis.
Yes, I have. What I've done is go through a lot of these. Well, I'm not raising any new species because I think that's the work of revisionary work that's best done by someone revising a particular group, and that's a lot of work involved with that. This is not a revisionary book. But yes, I have, where it's quite clear you've got two ants with the same name, I've sunk a number of names, about 30 names. So there's about 30 so-called subspecies that are now either been, a few cases have been lifted to full species because I think they are distinct, or they've been reduced to synonymous.
Thank you.
I was reading an interesting article the other day regarding our rural common size and ants, which is a very large ant, as we all know, and is a very powerful sting. And the process that they mentioned was they cut the ant in half. Have you heard of that experiment?
No.
The top part would be recommended, just bites onto the lower part, which has been cut in half, and it holds onto it until it dies.
It sounds so the animal ethics committee should be involved in that. It's not the sort of thing. It's I'm not quite sure what the you're looking for.
They did it many times, and the same thing happened every time.
I'm not quite sure what they did they say what they were trying to find? What sort of
Well, I don't know. That was the end result of them cutting the size and making it.
well, I need to know what the purpose was to be able to give all the information. Whether they're trying to see how its nervous system is operating, or I haven't heard. I think someone has mentioned it, but I can't unless I knew what the purpose of the experiment was. I couldn't comment on that, but. If I did know, it would probably be something to do with the way in which the nervous system reacts in this particular group. But I can't comment because I haven't seen the experiment. Yes.
Disturbance specialists, ants, before the first Homo sapiens came on to this continent, what would have caused the disturbance?
Tree fall during storms, landslides, landslips, things like that. Where you, even tectonic movement. There are some extinct volcanoes in Australia, so you've got some, areas like this. All these things, whether they are major biogeographical features like earthquakes or volcanoes, or whether they're small local ones like storms, cyclones, and that. All of these produce damage to the soil surface, and so these ants became adapted to colonise these particular habitats, and and over time they would have developed behaviours which a number of use, like having temporary nests and wide dietary preference and that sort of thing. So these ants became specialists, not specialists, but they were adapted to colonising those sorts of changed environments. Of course, once humans came in, their numbers obviously increased. Yes, because we create a lot of disturbance in this ant service. No, because they would follow trails. Most macropods have their own trails, even kangaroos that have trails through the undergrowth and that sort of thing, and the amount of soil surface would be fairly low. So we're still talking about much more major drivers of damage, like tree fall, like a massive tree fall after a storm where you get a lot of open ground or something like that. Yeah, yes, I saw a hand there. Do you have your hand up? No, okay.
Did you talk about nesting and
Not specifically. I do mention in the paper we're working at the moment, we're looking at ants which have particular requirements for their nests as another group. It's going to be rather different to the ant functional group paradigm that I mentioned here. So we do take into account in this other paper ants which seem to have a particular preference for their nests. So they'll be specialist nesters. They might only nest in wood, might only nest in certain types of soils, like sandy soils or loamy soils or gravelly soils. There are even ants, I'll just say that's an interesting fact, there's even a species of ant that only nests in peat, moist peat, and there's ants which only live in mangrove roots at low tide. So we have actually ants that swim. So there's many different strange features of ants which I haven't talked about here.
I see those now, like Christmas tree growing there, or sticks all over.
Stick nest ants, yes, the Iridomenes conifer and the other roaches. Yeah, they're a specialist. They obviously require certain sorts of soil. I have those as a soil specialist. And they use sort of vegetation associated with that, like sticks and cladodes from some native vegetation. They used to be common, they're becoming less common now because we're colonising that area in South Fremantle.
I've seen the Iridomenes conifer building there it's sort of a winter nest above the ground. Building them out tiny bits of charcoal rather than casuarina needles.
Well, ants are to some degree adaptable, so there's nothing around the traditional building materials, I suppose they use what best approximates it.
Does Australia have any of the Dracula ants? The ones that feed them the blood of their own larvae?
Oh, yeah, that's the Amblyoptenini. That's some of the Amblyoptenini. We've got several of those. We've got Onychomyrmex, Amblyoponi. We've got some of the others. There's some others that live in Queensland too. Yes, we've got some of those. I'm not sure of their feeding habits though, because I know that's taken for South America. Madagascar. Okay.
Any last questions? In that case, I'll put the lights back up. As far as show and tell this month goes, Sue brought in some board games, particularly the ant-related ones, Mermies.